Reading is interpretation. A poem well read is a poem well understood. In this podcast, brought to you by the Literary Life Podcast, poet Thomas Banks will help you increase your love and understanding of poetry. Poetry is not a silent endeavor. It's meant to be heard, and more importantly, it's meant to be recited out loud. Join us now as poet Thomas Banks presents The Well-Read Poem.
Hello, and welcome to The Well-Read Poem. Today's poem is a sonnet, continuing our theme of poems on familial subjects. And this is a sonnet by the 19th century English romantic poet John Keats, from whose writings I have taken some selections for this podcast before. John Keats, in this sonnet, commemorates a evening spent in the company of his brothers. And he doesn't give us a sense of exactly everything that transpired, but it is a very nice picture, an intimate picture of just domestic life. There aren't very many poems written by one brother to another. This is one I know of. There's another, a famous Roman poet, Catullus, wrote an elegy to his dead brother in the 1st century BC, around the time of Julius Caesar. But sibling life, I don't think has ever quite, sibling life has never been quite so rich a subject for poets as, life between spouses, lovers, and the like, which I guess is perhaps kind of natural. Anyhow, in this poem, Keats describes himself and his brothers. He had two of them sitting by the fire. He is attempting to write a poem, and they are evidently reading. Keats, two of his brothers, his two brothers, George and Tom, were both fairly close, I think, to Keats. He was good friends with both of them. He enjoyed that blessing. One of them, Tom, later died of tuberculosis in 1818, tuberculosis or consumption as it was then known. And Keats, who had some medical training, Keats was trained as a surgeon's assistant, attended to his brother while he was dying, and it seems that he contracted the disease during this period himself. And 3 years later, Keats died of consumption in Rome. Actually, if you ever find yourself in Rome, Keats is buried in the same cemetery as his peer and fellow romantic poet Percy Shelley. They are both buried in the Protestant cemetery in the city of Rome, along with, I think there's a number of other famous names there. It's not a large cemetery. There not being many Roman Protestants, as you might imagine, but I think a relative of Goethe is buried there, Goethe, the German poet and dramatist, and a few other names that you might recognize. Anyway, so if you're in Rome, make a point to drop by John Keats's grave, which has one of the best inscriptions of any grave I know about. On it is inscribed, "Here lies one whose name was writ on water." Kind of a haunting line. Anyhow, so this is To My Brothers by John Keats. This is one of his quieter, gentler, not a sublime poem. I won't claim that for it, but it is a moving one, and I think it has a kind of graceful, intimate touch to it. Small, busy flames play through the fresh-laid coals, and their faint cracklings o'er our silence creep like whispers of the household gods that keep a gentle empire o'er fraternal souls. And while for rhymes I search around the poles, your eyes are fixed as in poetic sleep upon the lore so voluble and deep that I at fall of night our care condoles. This is your birthday, Tom, and I rejoice that thus it passes smoothly, quietly. Many such eves of gentle whispering noise may we together pass, and calmly try what are this world's true joys, ere the great voice from its fair face shall bid our spirits fly. I like this poem for a number of reasons. I appreciate that Keats notices and commemorates, feelings of mortality, feelings that, good moments, even just quiet moments spent with one's family, as precious as they are not permanent. Perhaps some of their preciousness is due to the fact that they are not permanent, and that this is not a moment that will last forever. It's not a sentimental or even really a melancholy poem, but he does end it with that thought of transience, which seems to be kind of a surprise that strikes you at the end of the poem. Good poetry often involves surprises. And it's metrically, rhythmically, kind of a slow moving poem. Reading it aloud a few times, I noticed that it's one of those poems that kind of challenges you to read it slowly. Keats is a master of slowing the cadence of a poem down. And how does he do this? Sometimes by introducing, a certain number of long syllables, long vowels into a particular line. And I think he learned this technique mainly from Edmund Spenser, who also can be kind of a slow-moving, languorous sort of poet in his, not just in his Faerie Queene, but elsewhere as well. Edmund Spenser was one of Keats's idols, along with Shakespeare and Milton, I think, to some extent, probably the poet he learned the most from. And the influence of Spenser is never very far from the surface in any of Keats's major poetry, his mature poetry, almost all of which he wrote in the space of a few short years. Keats really seriously sat down to discipline himself as a writer and a poet in, 1818, late 18 teens. And most of his great poetry is written in the period of not much more than a year, honestly. It's biographers and literary scholars refer to it as Keats' Annus Mirabilis, which means his year of wonders. Anyhow, let me read this poem one more time and let you savor it. To My Brothers by John Keats. Small busy flames play through the fresh-laid coals, and their faint cracklings o'er our silence creep like whispers of the household gods that keep a gentle empire o'er fraternal souls. And while for rhymes I search around the poles, your eyes are fixed as in poetic sleep upon the lore so voluble and deep that I at fall of night our care condoles. This is your birthday, Tom, and I rejoice that thus it passes smoothly, quietly. Many such eves of gentle whispering noise may we together pass, and calmly try what are this world's true joys, ere the great voice from its fair face shall bid our spirits fly. One more note before I close. The other brother, I mean, this poem is entitled To My Brothers, plural. He mentions one of them by name, Tom Keats, who is the younger brother of John Keats, who died of consumption. The other brother, interestingly, George Keats, emigrated from England with his wife and settled in Kentucky. So if you are a Kentucky listener and you are in the vicinity of Louisville, or do they say Louisville there? Louisville? Anyway, however you locals say it. If you find yourself in the vicinity of Louisville, George Keats' grave is there in what cemetery, I do not know, but he moved out to Kentucky, reestablished himself as a planter and sort of a gentleman farmer and businessman, kind of a jack of several trades, was involved in local politics and civic life, and lived a very kind of middle class, sort of just practical life, not the kind you would expect from the brother of a poet, but he was not a bohemian in the way that John Keats was, and was one of those people who, when he died, was probably described as a pillar of his community, with his name on a lot of park benches and local monuments and things like that. So yeah, one of John Keats's brothers ended up in America. Fancy that. All right. This has been the Well-Read Poem. Thank you for listening very much, and I will reach you next time.
This has been The Well-Read Poem with poet Thomas Banks, brought to you by the Literary Life podcast. For show notes and the text of the poem, visit theliterary.life. To find out more about Thomas Banks and the poetry resources he offers, go to houseofhumaneletters.com. This podcast is patron supported. Visit patreon.com/theliterarylife to find out how you can support this podcast and get additional bonus content, including monthly live poetry explications. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you for listening.